Hello, welcome to this Gespi's Atari stuff video. When I visit another city, I always like to see if there is a retro game store. A few weeks ago I was in Dublin in Ireland and visited a local game store there and looking for some Atari stuff. They didn't have much there, but I did find this game, Sprint Master. I couldn't remember which game it was, but it offered cheaply, so I bought it. And when I looked it up later, I found out that this is the Atari 2600 port of Atari Sprint. And Atari Sprint has appeared in many forms. So it's time to delve a little bit deeper into the history of Atari Sprint. The first version of Atari Sprint appeared a long time ago in the arcade hall. There the race game went through several transformations before the game could be played in the living room. To understand the origin of Atari Sprint, we have to go all the way back to the starting point of Atari. Atari was founded in 1972 by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney. Nolan Bushnell had become familiar with the game Space War during his study, which ran on a computer system of the Stanford University. At that time, Nolan had a part-time job at an amusement park, and there he became familiar with the electromechanical arcade games. Wouldn't it be great if he could introduce Space War there? He convinced Tim Dabney of his idea and together they made the game Computer Space. The game wasn't very successful, partly because of its complexity. At the university the students had no trouble with Space War, but for visitors of arcades this was a different story. A next game would have to be easier to learn. Nolan was convinced that this had to be a racing game, based on the electromechanical racing games in the arcades. To make this game, they hired their first employee, Al Alcorn. To give Al Alcorn some experience before he started on a racing game, they gave him a practice project. He was asked to make a better version of the game Computer Tennis, which Nolan had seen shortly before during a demonstration of the Magnifox Odyssey. Al got to work and delivered a game that was actually quite good. And Ted and Al convinced Nolan to release this game first, before they started on the racing game. They called the game Pong, and it became a big success. After the success of Pong, Nolan's wish could finally be granted, a racing game. This eventually became the game Space Race, because according to Ted this could be realized quickly and that way they could meet Midway's contract obligations. The game consisted of two spaceships racing to the top of the screen while avoiding asteroids along the way. Space Race couldn't match the success of Pong, but Atari was already working on its next hit, Gotcha. But Space Race wasn't the racing game that Nolan had in mind. He wanted a game that reassembled the electromechanical game Speedway, but that quickly proved to be too complex for the technology of that time. So Atari asked his think tank Cyan Engineering to create an overhead view racing game. After a difficult process at Cyan, Al Alcorn took over the development. When the game was finished in 1974, it was released under the name Grand Track 10. Finally Nolan had his racing game. Later the Grand Track 20 variant was released. This game had two steering systems, so two players could race against each other. This gave Atari some time later the idea for his biggest game ever, Indy 800. Due to its size, it also became a very expensive game, and because of its high price range, it made it also possible to be the first game that made use of a color screen. In this game, up to 8 players could race against each other. Indy 800 was also an overhead view race game, because a driver's view was still too complex at that time. In 1976 this was solved by making a driver's view race game where you drive a car during the night. This game was released under the name Night Driver. During this period, a new technology also entered the arcade world, the microprocessor. Where games were previously made of separate components, a game could now be loaded into a microprocessor. This also opened the door to more complex games. With this new technology, Atari also came up with the idea to make a better version of Grand Track 10 and Indy 800. With the processor, it was possible to have a car drive a route calculated by the computer, instead of a fixed route. This resulted in the development of the game Atari Sprint 2, where the 2 did not indicate that it was a sequel, but that the game could be played with 2 players. Sprint 2 was a great success, resulting in several variants, Sprint 4 and Sprint 8, for 4 or 8 players. Later there was also a Sprint 1, where the player always had to compete against the computer. So Atari released several racing games in arcade, which resulted in the Atari Sprint games. But around the same time, another new development took place. Atari also entered the consumer market. With the home Pong console, they were already able to have some taste of it, but the big hit eventually came with the Atari Video Computer System. The Atari Video Computer System, which later became known as the Atari 2600, was released in 1977. At the time of its introduction, there were 9 launch titles available. Of course, there had to be also a racing game included, but Atari developed no less than 2 racing games during the launch. First there was Street Racer, a top-view vertical scroller game. Like many of its first generation 2600 games, it had very blocky graphics, but also had many game variations. The cars were controlled with a pedal controller, which was included with every 2600 at that time. The second racing game was a port of one of Atari's arcade racing games. Atari chose to port Indy 800 and called it Indy 500. Strange that they didn't choose the newer Sprint 2 game. The cars were controlled by included spinner controllers. The controllers looked like the pedal controller, but they could be turned infinitely. 2 controllers were included per game. It took until 1980 before Atari came up with a new racing game. That was a port of the game Night Driver, the first driver's view racing game. Some additions were added to the 2600 version of Night Driver. For example, there was ongoing traffic which had to be avoided. The car was controlled with the standard pedal controller. And after that, several other racing games were released, which were all driver's view race games. Atari had the greatest success with Pole Position, a racing game for which Atari had obtained a license from Namco. All these racing games were controlled with a joystick, because Atari no longer supplied pedals with its 2600. But in 1983 came the great video computer crash in North America. Atari suffered greatly from this, and the company was split in 2. The consumer division was sold to Jack Tramiel, who focused more on personal computers with the Atari ST. The coin-op division continued as Atari Games. In the second half of the 80s, the racing games became popular again, thanks to the game Outrun. So in 1986, Atari Games brought a new version of Atari Sprint to the arcades, under the name supersprint. This time with the current state of technology, so in color and with better graphics. The cabinet had 3 steering systems, so it could be played up to 3 players. A year later, 4 home versions of the game were also released, including one for the Atari ST. There was even a Nintendo version released by Tengen. Tengen was a label set up by Atari Games, which with its released game ports for the Nintendo NES. Meanwhile, Jack Tramiel's Atari also re-entered the gaming market again. After the success of the NES, Atari had released the 17800 console. But it had also revived the 2600 with the 2600 Junior. This time the system was marketed as a budget system. Old games were released for the new console in so-called red label cartridges. But Atari also released a number of new games. For one of those new games, Atari used one of its well-known IPs for which there was no 2600 port yet, namely Atari Sprint. So in 1988 Atari came up with Sprint Master, a port of the arcade game Supersprint. But Atari had one problem though. Sprint was really a game that had to be controlled with a steering wheel or a pedal, and Atari stopped making pedals for quite a while now. So the game was made in such a way that it could be controlled with a joystick, but this made the game very difficult to play. And in order to save money for the budget market, nothing was spent for new images for the game, it just reused the image of Pole Position. So now we arrived at Sprint Master. And can we finally do some racing now? I'm going to play Sprint Master on the new Atari 17800 Plus. For this I used the CX40 joystick for which this game was developed. And when Sprint Master is started, you can see immediately that it is a newer game. It has a start screen where a number of settings can be made. I'll leave the settings at the default for now. Then a track can be chosen. Let's start with the simplest one. Then a choice between road, dirt or ice. Here too I choose the simplest one, the road. Here we go. That's indeed not easy. Well, with a bit of luck we won anyway. Then now we are going to choose another track. We take this one. Oh, it's going completely wrong. This is a lot more difficult. What's happening here? What a disaster. No, this game is really impossible to control. Maybe I need to practice more, but I doubt it will really get much better. We indeed are missing the pedal controllers here. Too bad for the game. And have we now come to the end of the history of Atari Sprint? No, it goes a bit further, up to the present time. We move on to the point where Jactra Mills Atari tried to regain a share of the computer games market again. When that failed, also with the Atari Jaguar, the remains of Atari were sold to Hasbro Interactive in 1998. And Hasbro sold the Atari name again in 2001 to software publisher Infogrames. In 2009, Infogrames changed their own name to Atari SA. But in 2013, Atari SA went bankrupt. But Frederick Chesna continued with the Atari name, trying to get as much money out of it as possible. This resulted in an Atari casino, a cryptocurrency and even plans for an Atari hotel. This period was the moment when many Atari fans turned away from that Atari. The only thing that came out of this period was the Atari VCS. In 2021, Chesna sold his shares to Wade Rosen. And he's now working on turning Atari into a games-related company again, with the focus on retro and retro-inspired gaming. It started with the recharged games, but later hardware was also added, for example the Atari 2600 Plus. Wade also sought contact with other software companies to create new games inspired by existing Atari IPs. This resulted in a new Haunted House, Lunar Lander and recently Yars Rising. Atari also came in contact with software developer Headless Chicken. They wanted to make a remake of Atari Sprint. They got to work on it and came up in 2023 with Neo Sprint. They took the game a lot further than the old Atari Sprint. The flat top view became more a 3D side view. And they added a new zoom view. This zoomed in the part of the track where your car was driving. There were different race variants that could be raced by up to 8 people at the same time. There's even a constructor mode where you can design your own racetrack. They first made an early access version available exclusively for the Atari VCS. The game was not yet completely finished, but VCS users could buy it for a reduced price. This was because the Atari VCS community is a very involved group, and they could suggest improvements via Atari's Discord server. With the VCS version you also have the big advantage that the car can be controlled with the spinner of the classic controller. That was the big flaw of Sprint Master. This year the full version of Neo Sprint was released. This time not only for the VCS, but also for the Xbox, PlayStation, Switch and Steam. And with that, we come to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed this little history. If so, I hope you will also click on the like button. And I still need a few more subscribers to get to the 1000 subscribers. So, please also click on the subscribe button. Then I will now continue with Sprint Master to see if I can get any better in it. But for now, until the next Gespi Atari Stop video, bye!